Arthur Pendelton had had enough of the 21st century. At 52, Arthur was a man who had conquered the digital realm. He had engineered algorithms that predicted consumer behavior before the consumers themselves knew they were hungry, and his bank account was swollen with the proceeds of 3 successful tech startups. He possessed a mind like a razor and a patience that was non-existent. What Arthur Pendelton desired, with an intensity that bordered on spiritual mania, was absolute, impenetrable solitude. He was tired of board meetings. He was tired of synergy and disruptive innovations. Most of all, he was tired of people. Humanity, in his estimation, was a chaotic, loud, and inefficient species. He wanted a plug-and-play life, a sanctuary where the only variable was the flavor of his morning smoothie. So, he did what any self-respecting billionaire would do: he opened his secure satellite laptop and decided to buy tranquility. His target was Isla del Sol, an asset being offloaded by a failing European conglomerate. The sales brochure, a glossy digital masterpiece, promised a fully automated, high-tech private sanctuary in the archipelagos of Southeast Asia. It boasted a state-of-the-art mansion managed by an advanced AI, named Athena, a geothermal cooling system, self-maintaining hydroponic gardens, and a harbor that automatically docked vessels using magnetic guidance. It was the absolute pinnacle of isolationist luxury. Arthur Pendelton was not a man to dally with due diligence when his peace of mind was at stake. He contacted the listing agent, a man with a disconcertingly slippery digital footprint named Barnaby Q. Slythe. The negotiations were short, conducted entirely via encrypted voice changers. Arthur, feeling the urgent pull of tropical serenity, didn't even argue when the price was hiked by 20% for expedited closing fees. He signed the deed. He signed the non-disclosure agreements. He transferred the money, a sum that could have purchased a small European nation. "It's a paradise, Mr. P." Slythe's distorted voice had crackled over the line. There was a small clerical update on the official mapping nomenclature, purely bureaucratic, of course, but the property you described is officially yours. Isla del Sol has been recorded under its historical designation in the latest regional registry. Standard operating procedure. Arthur, sipping an 18-year-old scotch and imagining the hum of the automated geothermal system, barely listened. He saw deed transfer and closed. That was all that mattered. 3 days later, the tax haven, Arthur's sleek, silver-hulled amphibious yacht, was cutting through the sapphire waters of the Java Sea. He was alone. Athena, the advanced AI he had already prepaid to run his entire life, was supposedly waiting for his voice print to activate the island's defensive perimeter and stock his biometric refrigerator. He approached the coordinate marker on his digital chart. The chart confirmed he was approaching Monkey's Maw, the historical designation Slythe had mentioned. The name was crude, Arthur thought, likely given by uncreative 19th-century Dutch cartographers. The brochure's rendering of Isla del Sol showed manicured lawns and white stone villa walls that seemed to grow seamlessly from the limestone cliffs. But as the tax haven rounded the final headland, the image on his dashboard did not match the horizon. Arthur Pendelton frowned, adjusted his prescription sunglasses, and tapped the screen. In front of him, looming like a primal threat, was a single, jagged volcanic spire. It wasn't the inviting, gentle dome of the brochure. This place was a geological fist aimed at the sky. Dense, aggressively green canopy choked every square inch of the steep slopes, and a permanent, low-hanging mist seemed to cling to the peak, as if the island itself was breathing. "This is incorrect," Arthur muttered, his voice a calm monotone that belied the sudden ice in his stomach. He zoomed into the digital map. The coordinates matched perfectly. This was Monkey's Maw. There was no smart harbor. There were no magnetic docking arrays. There was only a crumbling, barnacle-encrusted stone jetty that looked as if it hadn't seen a human being since the advent of the steam engine. The AI must be in camouflage mode, Arthur rationalized, though he didn't believe it. He guided the tax haven manually toward the dilapidated jetty. As the yacht's hull scraped gently against the weathered stone, the first sensory assault hit him. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with humidity and a complex scent profile of wet earth, rotting fruit, and something musty, something living. And the noise. It wasn't the soothing sound of automated tranquility. It was a chaotic, layered din. A rising crescendo of shrieks, hoots, whistles, and a rhythmic, thumping vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Arthur stood on the deck, immaculate in his beige linen suit and white sneakers, and stared. 50 feet from the jetty, where the jungle met the rock, Arthur's automated villa was supposed to be. Instead, he saw the skeletal remains of a structure. It was an ancient, crumbling stone villa, built in a forgotten colonial style, suffocating under a blanket of aggressive vines. There was no glass in the windows, only gaping black holes. The roof was half collapsed. His hand trembled slightly as he retrieved his phone. He tried to ping Athena. No response. He tried to access the biometric security system. Network error. He called Barnaby Q. Slythe. Number no longer in service. Arthur stared at the screen, the reality sinking into his hyper-logical mind like a lead anchor. A clerical error. A historical designation. Slythe hadn't just sold him the wrong island, he had sold him an unlisted tropical ruin using another island's brochure. Arthur had purchased Monkey's Maw. The name, he realized with a sick lurch, was not a metaphor. This is a setback, he announced to the oppressive heat. He was Arthur Pendelton. He solved problems. He would reclaim this island. He had a top-tier camping survival kit, purchased just in case Athena required 12 hours for a full firmware update, and he would survive until his legal team sued Slythe into non-existence. Arthur grabbed his waterproof, Kevlar weave rucksack. He set foot on the stone jetty. It groaned. He decided that the first thing he needed to do was survey his new territory. Perhaps the stone structure, though archaic, possessed a useful foundation. Perhaps there was still geothermal activity. He took 3 steps onto the island's soil. The vibration in the jungle suddenly stopped. The silence that replaced it was profound, heavy, and infinitely more terrifying than the noise. Arthur froze. He could feel eyes. Hundreds of eyes. Is anyone there? He asked, trying to sound like a man who wasn't about to have a heart attack in a $4,000 linen suit. He looked up. The jungle canopy, 20 feet above him, seemed to shift. It began slowly. A few small, brownish forms dropping from branch to branch. Then more. They flooded the trees, an organized, synchronized descent. Hundreds of them. They weren't just common monkeys. These were Capuchins, their pale, expressive faces staring at him with a startling lack of animal fear. They were not running away. They were positioning themselves. They lined the branches in perfect formation, creating a wall of fur and curiosity. They were absolutely silent, which Arthur found deeply disturbing. They didn't chortle. They just watched. Arthur tried to channel his billionaire negotiator persona. He took a slow breath, squared his shoulders, and smiled. A non-threatening, pleasant, let's do business smile. Hello, Arthur said clearly, holding up his hands. I seem to be the new owner of this island. Arthur Pendelton. Nice to meet you. The monkeys didn't react. Then, from the center of the largest banyan tree, the canopy parted. A different figure descended. This one was a male macaque, significantly larger than the others. He was ancient. His fur was a mottled gray, and a jagged, silvery scar ran from his right ear down to his jaw, giving him a look of perpetual, focused malevolence. He moved with a heavy, purposeful gait, dropping to the low branch directly above Arthur's head. This macaque was not curious. He was offended. He sat on the branch and looked Arthur Pendleton up and down, as if reviewing a bad investment portfolio. He sniffed the air, exhaled a low snort, and locked eyes with Arthur. This was the general. Arthur didn't know the name yet, but he felt the presence. This monkey claimed sovereignty. Arthur Pendleton, who had argued intellectual property rights with Silicon Valley titans, felt smaller than he ever had in his life. He decided, based on all available data, that diplomacy was the best first approach. He reached into his pocket slowly and pulled out a premium, air-sealed bar of Belgian dark chocolate, a personal luxury he was forced to ration. "Perhaps," Arthur whispered, peeling the foil, "a small token of my..." The general didn't wait. He didn't even look at the chocolate. His eyes were focused solely on Arthur's smooth forehead. With a movement too fast to track, the general didn't grab, he didn't attack. He simply reached to his left, grabbed a large, unripe, solid green coconut, and with a fluid motion that bespoke decades of practice he dropped it. Bonk. The sound was shockingly loud, a sickening thud of rock against organic matter. The coconut hit Arthur Pendleton dead center on the forehead, exactly where his prepaid massage therapy from Athena was supposed to be administered. Arthur didn't scream. He just dropped to one knee, clutching his head, stars dancing in his vision. "You brute," Arthur managed to groan, his carefully constructed reality shattering. Above him, the silence broke. But it wasn't the chaotic hooting from before. This was a synchronized, rhythmic chattering. The hundreds of Capuchins were clapping their hands and pointing at the billionaire who was currently bleeding on their beach. The general stared down at the groveling man, snorted once more, and deliberately reached for a second coconut. Arthur Pendleton looked up, the Belgian chocolate melting into the dirt. He was a billionaire. He was a tech visionary. And at that exact moment, kneeling in the humidity of Monkey's Maw, he was officially at war. He didn't have his AI. He didn't have his automated geothermal cooling. He had a concussion, a melting chocolate bar, and 500 enemy combatants with perfect aim. The adventure had begun. The world didn't end with a bang, but with a thunk. Arthur Pendleton lay flat on the jagged pebbles of the shoreline, the salty spray of the Java Sea stinging his nostrils. His forehead felt like it had been struck by a miniature comet. For a solid 3 minutes, his vision was a kaleidoscope of pulsing violet fractals and floating translucent specks. When the world finally stopped spinning, the first thing he saw was a pair of golden brown eyes staring down at him from a nearby driftwood log. It was a juvenile Capuchin. It looked concerned, or perhaps it was just checking to see if he was still edible. Arthur groaned, pushing himself up on shaking elbows. "System, status," he muttered, his brain still trying to interface with an AI that wasn't there. He reached for his temple and felt a lump the size of a golf ball. He looked toward the jungle. The wall of monkeys hadn't moved. They were still there, hundreds of them, perched like silent gargoyles in the emerald canopy. The general, that scarred macaque patriarch, remained on his low-hanging branch, his arms crossed over his barrel chest in a gesture that was unsettlingly human. He looked like a landlord waiting for a delinquent tenant to pack his bags. "Right," Arthur hissed, his voice cracking. "Message received. You're the local welcoming committee. Very primal. Very avant-garde. But I have the deed, you flea-bitten bureaucrats. I have the legal right-of-way." Arthur staggered back to the tax haven. He needed his tools. He was a man of logic, of engineering, of superior supply chains. If the monkeys wanted a conflict of resources, he would show them what 20 years of venture capitalism could buy. He spent the afternoon unloading the Apex survival pod of $15,000 carbon fiber, self-inflating tent that looked more like a lunar lander than a piece of camping gear. He dragged it onto a flat patch of sand just beyond the high tide mark, a safe distance from the overhanging branches. He set up his portable desalination unit, his solar kinetic charging array, and a perimeter of ultrasonic pest repellers he had bought on a whim during a late-night bender on a luxury gadget site. Phase 1, Infrastructure, Arthur announced, wiping sweat from his brow with a silk handkerchief. The monkeys watched the entire process. They didn't interfere. They simply sat, observing his high-tech displays with an expression Arthur could only describe as judgmental. Occasionally, a younger monkey would reach for a branch, only to be barked back into place by a sharp vocalization from the general. They were waiting. They were studying his tech stack. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and bruised purple, Arthur decided to attempt a final diplomatic overture. He knew that in business, every opponent had a price. He opened a crate of artisanal tropical fusion medley dehydrated mangoes, pineapples, and papayas dusted with organic chili powder. It was the kind of snack that cost $40 a bag in a Manhattan boutique. He walked to the edge of the clearing, keeping his eyes on the general, and laid the bag open on a flat stone. "A peace offering," Arthur said, trying to modulate his voice to a soothing, mid-level frequency. "Consider this a signing bonus. There's plenty more where that came from if we can establish a mutually beneficial non-interference pact." The general hopped down from his branch. He approached the stone with a slow, limping gait that suggested he had survived more than one predator in his long life. He sniffed the dried mango. He picked up a piece, tasted it, and then with a deliberate, slow-motion flick of his wrist tossed it into the dirt. He looked Arthur in the eye, bared his teeth in a terrifyingly wide grin, and let out a sharp, piercing whistle. Then, he turned around and urinated on the bag. Arthur stood frozen. That was a very clear no, wasn't it? Night fell over Monkey's Maw like a heavy velvet curtain. The jungle, which had been noisy during the day, became a symphony of horrors. The ultrasonic repellers hummed with a low, blue light, and Arthur retreated into his carbon fiber pod, locking the pressurized zipper. He felt safe. He had a satellite phone, which still hadn't found a signal, a tactical flashlight, and a bag of protein bars. "I can outlast them," he told himself, lying on his memory foam sleeping pad. "I'll call the helicopter in the morning. I'll hire a security detail. I'll have this island cleared by Friday." He was drifting into a fitful sleep when the first sound reached him. Clink. It was the sound of metal hitting stone. Then, a rhythmic thump-thump-thump against the side of his tent. Arthur sat up, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Who's there?" He grabbed his tactical flashlight and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the translucent walls of the pod. Outside, he saw shadows. Dozens of them. They weren't just running around, they were dancing. Suddenly, the tent wall to his left collapsed. The monkeys hadn't attacked him, they had attacked his infrastructure. They had realized that the magic blue lights, the ultrasonic repellers, were powered by wires. While Arthur had been dreaming of lawsuits, a team of Capuchins had systematically chewed through his solar kinetic cables. A cacophony of shrieks erupted. The first skirmish had begun. Arthur scrambled for the zipper, but it wouldn't budge. He realized with a jolt of horror that the monkeys had jammed the mechanism with something sticky fermented durian fruit, by the smell of it. He was trapped in his own $15,000 Apex coffin. The tent began to shake violently. The monkeys weren't trying to get in, they were trying to move the tent. Through the mesh window, Arthur saw the general standing on his desalination unit, directing the chaos like a conductor. "Hey! Stop that! This is high-modulus polyethylene!" Arthur screamed, thumping the walls. The monkeys ignored him. With a coordinated heave, a group of 20 large macaques grabbed the guide ropes and began dragging the tent toward the tree line. Arthur tumbled inside like a sock in a dryer. His satellite phone flew out of his pocket. His tactical flashlight rolled under his sleeping pad. "You're making a mistake," Arthur yelled, his voice muffled by the carbon fiber. I am a Tier 1 investor. I have connections. The tent hit a root and flipped. Arthur's world became a chaotic mess of silk ties, protein bars, and expensive electronics. He heard the sound of ripping fabric. The monkeys were using sharpened stones to saw through the reinforced floor. A hand, small, leathery, and incredibly strong, reached through a hole in the bottom of the tent. It didn't grab Arthur. It grabbed his satellite phone. No. Not the phone. Arthur lunged for it, but the hand retracted with the speed of a serpent. Outside, he heard a triumphant screech. He managed to kick his way through the cooling vent flap, spilling out onto the muddy jungle floor in his silk pajamas. The scene was a nightmare. His campsite had been dismantled with surgical precision. His solar panels were being dragged into the bushes. His desalination unit was being dismantled by a group of adolescent monkeys who seemed to be having a contest to see who could unscrew the bolts the fastest. And high above, perched on a branch that hung over the ruins of the stone villa, was the general. In his hand, he held Arthur's $2,000 encrypted satellite phone. The general looked at the device, then looked at Arthur. With a flick of his thumb, he dropped the phone. It didn't hit the ground. It fell straight into the salt spring, a deep, bubbling pool of mineral-rich water that sat at the heart of the ruins. Splash! Arthur's only link to civilization was gone. The monkeys didn't stop there. As Arthur stood there, shivering and barefoot, they began a bombing run. From the canopy, a rain of fermented fruit, mud balls, and to Arthur's utter disgust their own waste began to pelt him. Retreat! Arthur cried, shielding his head with his arms. I am declaring a tactical retreat. He scrambled toward the only structure left standing, the crumbling stone villa. He dove through a broken window, tumbling onto a floor covered in decades of dust and dried leaves. Outside, the monkeys gathered at the edge of the ruin, hooting and hollering in a victory chant that echoed through the volcanic spire. The general walked to the window ledge. He didn't enter. He simply sat there, silhouetted against the moonlight. He reached into his cheek pouch, pulled out a silk tie, Arthur's favorite Hermes necktie, and slowly, deliberately, tied it around his own neck like a trophy. He gave a final, mocking hoot and vanished into the darkness. Arthur Pendelton sat in the corner of the ruin, hugging his knees to his chest. He was covered in mud, his forehead was throbbing, his tech was trashed, and he was currently being out-negotiated by a primate who was wearing his favorite tie. The silence returned to the island, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a siege. Fine, Arthur whispered into the dark, his eyes narrowing with a spark of his old, ruthless corporate fire. You want a war of attrition? You want to play dirty? You have no idea how petty a billionaire can be. He looked around the room. In the corner, amidst the debris, he saw a rusted iron pipe and a heavy stone. It wasn't high-tech. It wasn't automated. But as Arthur Pendelton gripped the pipe, he realized he wasn't a CEO anymore. He was a combatant. Arthur Pendelton woke to the sound of a rhythmic, wet slapping noise. He was curled on a pile of sun-bleached burlap sacks in the corner of the villa's great hall, which was currently a great hall only in the sense that it was a large room with no roof and a lot of bat droppings. He opened one eye, his forehead throbbing in a steady, purple rhythm. The slapping noise was coming from the window ledge. A young Capuchin was sitting there, casually slapping a wet mud pie against the stone frame while staring at Arthur with an expression of intense boredom. When Arthur sat up, the monkey didn't flee. It simply picked up the mud pie, tossed it into the room, missing Arthur by a mere inch, and let out a short, dismissive bark before somersaulting backward into the jungle. Mockery, Arthur croaked, his voice sounding like sandpaper on glass. They've moved from tactical assault to psychological deconstruction. He stood up, his joints popping. His $4,000 linen suit was now a collection of stained rags. His left shoe was missing, presumed stolen by the supply chain looters in the trees. But as he looked out at the ruins of his camp, Something in Arthur's brain, the part that had once orchestrated a hostile takeover of a rival social media conglomerate, snapped into place. He wasn't a victim. He was a founder. And this island was a startup. It was currently underperforming, plagued by bad management, the monkeys, and in desperate need of a restructuring. First order of business, Arthur whispered, pointing a finger at the empty air where a whiteboard should have been. Resource acquisition. He spent the morning trekking back to the jetty. To his relief, the tax haven hadn't been sunk, though it had been thoroughly redecorated. The monkeys had figured out how to open the deck lockers. His emergency flares had been fired off into the ocean. He saw the charred casings floating near the shore, and his expensive upholstery had been shredded to make nests. However, they hadn't been able to penetrate the heavy, reinforced steel of the yacht's engine room or the waterproof tech vault. Arthur spent 4 grueling hours hauling crates back to the villa. He moved with the stealth of a man who had once dodged process servers in 3 different continents. By noon, he had a war chest, a heavy-duty waterproof Bluetooth speaker, designed for outdoor raves, a case of high-pressure Code 2 canisters used for the yacht's self-inflating life rafts, several rolls of industrial-strength duct tape, a crate of vintage balsamic vinegar, don't ask, and a collection of high-tensile fishing line. Now, Arthur grinned, a wild, unhinged look appearing in his eyes. Let's discuss the terms of service. The monkeys were congregating for their afternoon nap in the salt spring area, the flooded courtyard of the villa where the mineral water bubbled up. They were relaxed. The general was draped over a stone pillar, picking bits of Belgian chocolate out of his teeth with one of Arthur's discarded cufflinks. Suddenly, a sound tore through the jungle. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the thunderous, high-fidelity opening notes of Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, played at maximum volume through a 120-decibel waterproof speaker hidden inside a hollowed-out log. The effect was instantaneous. The Capuchins bolted upright, screeching in terror as the bass vibrated through their very bones. The general fell off his pillar, his eyes wide with shock. But Arthur wasn't done. As the monkeys scrambled toward the trees, they tripped his perimeter defense level 1. He had rigged the high-tensile fishing line across the main paths, connected to the Code 2 canisters. As the monkeys hit the lines, the canisters were punctured, releasing a high-pitched hiss and a cloud of freezing white vapor. To a primate, it looked like the ground itself was screaming and breathing smoke. Disruptive innovation. Arthur yelled from the safety of the villa's balcony, waving a tattered silk shirt like a flag. How do you like the user interface now, you furry little shareholders? The monkeys retreated in a chaotic blur of limbs and fur. For the first time since his arrival, Arthur Pendelton felt like he owned the deed. He spent the rest of the afternoon setting up Trap 2.0. He used the yacht's high-pressure deck hose, connected to a manual pump he'd salvaged, to create a seltzer slinger. He filled a bucket with the vintage balsamic vinegar and water, a mixture that was harmless but smelled like a salad gone horribly wrong and stung the eyes. By sunset, Arthur had established a green zone. He had cleared the villa of debris and set up a tripod-mounted vinegar cannon in the main doorway. He felt invincible. He even found a tin of smoked oysters and a bottle of sparkling water that hadn't been smashed. He sat on a stone crate, enjoying his victory dinner, watching the stars come out over the volcano. Strategy, Arthur toasted the moon. It's what separates us from the... Wait. He heard a sound. Not a screech. A clink. Then another. Clink. Clink. Scrape. It was coming from the roof. Or what was left of it. Arthur grabbed his tactical flashlight and shone it upward. He expected to see a monkey. Instead, he saw a shadow, a large, heavy shadow moving with deliberate slowness. The monkeys hadn't run away. They had regrouped. And they had learned. The general appeared at the edge of the roofline. He wasn't screaming. He was holding something. It was a heavy, volcanic rock, wrapped in a piece of shredded upholstery to give it grip. Behind him, dozens of other monkeys appeared, all of them carrying rocks, or heavy branches, or Arthur's heart sank the heavy brass components they had stripped from his yacht's winch. They're utilizing gravity, Arthur whispered. The general gave a short, sharp whistle. Crash. A rock the size of a grapefruit smashed into Arthur's seltzer slinger, snapping the tripod. Another rock hit the Bluetooth speaker, silencing Wagner in a burst of sparks and static. Hey! That's expensive hardware! Arthur shouted, diving under a stone archway as a hail of debris began to rain down into the villa. The monkeys weren't just throwing things, they were targeting his infrastructure. They had realized that Arthur's power came from his boxes. If they broke the boxes, the man became weak. The bombardment lasted for an hour. Arthur was pinned down in the corner, shielding his head with a piece of sheet metal. He realized with a growing sense of dread that he was being outscaled. For every trap he built, there were 500 monkeys ready to break it. For every gallon of vinegar he sprayed, there was a fresh supply of mud and rocks. But the final blow of the night was the most tactical. The villa had an old, wide-mouthed chimney that led down to the fireplace where Arthur had been trying to start a small, comforting fire. As he crouched in the dark, he heard a heavy thud from above. Then another. The air in the room suddenly became thick and acrid. The monkeys were clogging the chimney. They were dropping wet leaves, moss, and mud down the flue, sealing it shut. The smoke from Arthur's fire had nowhere to go. It began to fill the room, stinging his eyes and lungs. Cough, you geniuses! Arthur gasped, crawling toward the window on his hands and knees. He collapsed outside, gasping for fresh air, only to find himself surrounded. The monkeys weren't attacking him yet. They were standing in a wide circle, just out of reach, watching him struggle. In the center of the circle stood the general. The macaque walked forward, his Hermes tie fluttering in the night breeze. He stopped 3 feet from Arthur. He reached down and picked up one of the CO2 canisters that had failed to fire. He looked at it, then looked at Arthur, and with a terrifying display of strength, he smashed the canister against a rock until it dented. He then dropped it in front of Arthur's face. It was a message: your toys don't scare us anymore. The general turned and pointed toward the salt spring. The monkeys began to move toward it, but they didn't go to drink. They began to pile rocks around the spring, building a crude wall. Arthur watched, his eyes watering from the smoke. He finally understood. This wasn't just a random turf war. The monkeys weren't just being pests. They were protecting the spring. The villa had been built right on top of their only reliable source of minerals and clean water during the dry season. To the monkeys, Arthur wasn't the owner, he was an invasive species that had parked its silver nest, the yacht, in their harbor and was now polluting their sacred well with Wagner and balsamic vinegar. It's a resource conflict, Arthur realized, his billionaire brain finally seeing the market forces at play. You're not an army. You're a tribe. And I'm the developer who just destroyed your downtown. The general looked back at him one last time, baring his teeth. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a challenge. Arthur Pendelton sat in the mud, covered in ash and vinegar, watching the monkeys fortify their position. He had lost his tech. He had lost his green zone. He had lost his dignity. But as he looked at the salt spring and the organized way the monkeys worked together, a new plan began to form. He couldn't win through force. He couldn't win through disruption. He needed to change his business model. Okay, General, Arthur whispered, leaning his head against a palm tree. You want to talk sovereignty? You want to talk land rights? Fine. But first, I'm going to need to build a projector. And I'm going to need a lot of bananas. The war wasn't over. It was just entering the negotiation phase. The transition from aggressive developer to diplomatic refugee was not an easy one for Arthur Pendleton. By the third morning of the Siege of Monkey's Maw, Arthur had reached a physiological and psychological equilibrium. He was no longer the man who complained if his espresso was 2 degrees below the optimal temperature. He was a man who had successfully defended a single, bruised papaya from a persistent squirrel using nothing but a sharpened toothbrush and a very stern look. "The market has shifted," Arthur whispered to a lizard that was currently sunning itself on his knee. "Hostile takeovers are off the table. It's time for a merger." Arthur realized that his previous attempts at guerrilla warfare had failed because he was fighting against the environment, whereas the monkeys were the environment. To win, or at least to survive without losing an eye, he had to speak their language not in chattering hoots, but in the universal currency of all living things, value proposition. He spent the first half of the day on a resource audit. He trekked back to the tax haven, which was now less a yacht and more a floating primate gymnasium. He moved with a new kind of stealth, barefoot and covered in a camouflage of mud and crushed fern leaves. He managed to slip into the tech vault in the subdeck. To his immense relief, his investor's presentation kit, a ruggedized, high-lumen microprojector and a solar-powered slate was still sealed in its EMP-proof casing. He also found a roll of white silk projection screen and, most importantly, a crate of vacuum-sealed gourmet Cavendish bananas he had brought as a high-potassium snack for his, now non-existent, morning jogs. Phase 4, the content strategy, Arthur muttered. He didn't just grab the bananas and run. He understood that in a parley, presentation was everything. He spent the afternoon in the jungle, not setting traps, but harvesting. He used his knowledge of structural engineering to weave himself a suit of state. It was a ridiculous, heavy garment made of broad, waxy banana leaves stitched together with high-tensile fishing line. It looked like a cross between a ghillie suit and a very confused salad, but it served a purpose. It signaled that he was no longer a man of the suits, but a man of the island. As the sun began to set, Arthur approached the ruins of the villa. He didn't sneak. He walked right down the center of the main path, his banana leaf suit rustling with every step. The monkeys were already there, hundreds of them, lining the stone walls of the salt spring. The air was thick with tension. The bombing squads were already in position on the roof, their hands filled with mud and stones. Arthur stopped 10 feet from the spring. He didn't look at the monkeys. He looked at the ground. He knelt, a gesture of submission he hadn't performed since his last tax audit, and began to set up his altar of diplomacy. He unfolded the white silk screen and draped it over a standing stone pillar. He set up the microprojector on a flat rock. Finally, he opened the crate of gourmet Cavendish bananas. The scent, sweet, rich, and unbruised, wafted through the humid air. A collective gasp, or the primate equivalent of it, rippled through the trees. These weren't the small, sour wild bananas of the island. These were the Tier 1 alpha fruits of the global supply chain. "General!" Arthur shouted, his voice echoing off the volcanic cliffs. "I request a parley." The canopy parted. The general descended, moving with a regal, terrifying grace. He was still wearing the Hermes tie, now hopelessly stained and knotted, and he looked at Arthur's banana leaf suit with what could only be described as professional curiosity. The general landed on the stone pillar right next to the silk screen. He looked at the bananas, then at Arthur. He bared his teeth, but he didn't signal the attack. He was waiting. "You think this island is yours because you were here first," Arthur began, standing up slowly. He tapped the solar slate. "And I thought it was mine because I have a digital file in a cloud server 5,000 miles away. We were both wrong. This island is a shared asset. And currently, the operating expenses are killing us both." Arthur hit the play button. The microprojector whirred to life, casting a brilliant, 4K beam onto the silk screen. The monkeys shrieked and jumped back, but the sheer novelty of the light held them in place. Arthur didn't show them movies or news. He showed them themselves. He had spent his first hour on the island before the first coconut hit, recording the monkeys with his yacht's high-definition perimeter cameras. On the screen, the monkeys saw the salt spring from an angle they had never seen. They saw the general leading the charge. They saw the younger monkeys playing in the ruins. The chatter died down. The monkeys were mesmerized. They were seeing their own lives reflected back at them through the magic of the man box. Then, Arthur swiped the screen. He showed them the future. He used a basic architectural app to overlay a 3D model onto the ruins of the villa. He showed a version of the island where the villa wasn't a fortress, but a bridge. He showed the salt spring being cleaned of debris, with stone steps built for easy access. He showed feeding stations located far away from his living quarters. He showed a security perimeter that protected the monkeys from the outside world, represented by a scary-looking icon of a poacher's boat. "I have the tools to make this place a fortress for all of us," Arthur said, pointing to the screen. "You provide the local security. I provide the infrastructure and the external logistics. We stop the war. We start a joint venture." He took one of the gourmet Cavendish bananas, peeled it, and broke it in half. He ate one half, proving it wasn't poisoned, and held the other half out to the general. The silence was absolute. Even the crickets seemed to stop chirping. The general looked at the screen, then at the half banana, then at the man in the ridiculous leaf suit. He leaned forward, his scarred face inches from Arthur's. Arthur could smell the fermented fruit and the primal musk of the jungle leader. He didn't flinch. He held the general's gaze with the same intensity he had once used to stare down a hostile board of directors. The general reached out. His hand, leathery and warm, brushed against Arthur's palm. He took the banana. He didn't eat it immediately. He climbed back up to the top of the stone pillar and held the banana high above his head, letting out a long, haunting ululation that echoed across the entire monkey's maw. From the jungle, 500 voices answered back. It wasn't a war cry. It was an acknowledgement. The general sat down, peeled the rest of the banana, and took a bite. His eyes widened. The gourmet Cavendish had done its job. He looked at Arthur and gave a single, slow nod. Arthur let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 3 days. "Excellent. I'll have my legal team draw up actually, let's just stick to the handshake for now." But the parley wasn't over. The general hopped down and pointed toward the salt spring. He beckoned Arthur to follow. They walked to the edge of the bubbling water. The general reached into the mud at the base of the spring and pulled out a heavy, encrusted object. He handed it to Arthur. It was Arthur's satellite phone. It was cracked, waterlogged, and utterly dead. The general then pointed toward the horizon, where the faint lights of a distant shipping lane could be seen. He made a throwing motion, then pointed back at the phone, then at Arthur. "You want me to stay?" Arthur asked, surprised. "Or you're telling me I'm stuck here?" The general didn't answer. He simply sat by the spring and began to groom his fur, occasionally glancing at the magic screen which was still looping a video of a monkey successfully catching a falling coconut. Arthur looked at his broken phone, then at his ruined villa, then at the 500 business partners currently lounging in his backyard. For the first time in his life, Arthur Pendelton didn't feel the need to check his email. He didn't feel the need to disrupt anything. He felt, for lack of a better word, home. "Fine," Arthur sighed, sitting down on a rock next to the general. "But if we're going to do this, we're going to need a better waste management system. And I'm definitely not wearing the leaf suit on Mondays." The general let out a soft hoot, which Arthur chose to interpret as agreement pending. The Great Banana Truce had been signed. But as Arthur looked up at the volcano, he realized that a truce was just the beginning. Now came the hard part, the integration phase. 3 weeks had passed since the signing of the Great Banana Truce, and Arthur Pendelton had undergone a radical rebranding. He no longer resembled the man who had stepped off the tax haven in a pristine linen suit. His skin was now a deep, rugged bronze, decorated with a map of minor scratches and mosquito bites. His hair was tied back with a piece of high-tensile fishing line, and he had upgraded his suit of state to a more functional tactical sarong made from a repurposed sail and duct tape. He was no longer a CEO, he was the chief logistics officer of Monkey's Maw. The joint venture was, surprisingly, thriving. Arthur had spent the last 20 days applying his knowledge of workflow optimization to the island's primate society. He had cleared the salt spring of centuries of volcanic silt, doubling its output. In return, the monkeys had stopped bombing his villa and had instead begun a daily delivery service. Every morning, a pile of fresh mangoes, heart of palm, and clean rainwater, collected in salvaged champagne buckets, appeared on Arthur's porch. Efficiency, Arthur noted, marking a tally on a stone wall with a piece of charcoal. When the incentives are aligned, the workforce is impeccable. The general had become something of a silent board chairman. He spent most of his time lounging on a stone throne Arthur had fashioned for him from a yacht seat and some mahogany logs. He still wore the Hermes tie, it was now his official seal of office. They didn't speak, but they had developed a sophisticated system of nods, grunts, and pointed fingers that handled everything from border disputes to fruit quality control. However, Arthur knew that in the world of high-stakes real estate, a closed deal is never truly closed until the lawyers stop circling. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday morning by the low, predatory hum of a high-performance turbine engine. Arthur and the general were at the salt spring, discussing the potential installation of a gravity-fed shower system, when the sound echoed through the volcanic spire. It wasn't the clumsy chugging of a local fishing boat. This was the sound of corporate interest. Arthur grabbed his salvaged binoculars and looked toward the harbor. A sleek, black and chrome interceptor vessel, the SS Arbitrage, was slicing through the surf. Standing on the prow, wearing an eye-wateringly white suit and clutching a digital tablet, was Barnaby Q. Slythe. "Ah," Arthur whispered, his eyes narrowing. "The auditor has arrived." The general let out a low, guttural growl, his hackles rising. He looked at Arthur, his eyes asking a very clear question: should we drop the heavy rocks now, or wait for them to land? "Patience, Chairman," Arthur said, placing a hand on the macaque's shoulder. "In business, we allow the opponent to present their opening offer before we liquidate them. Let's prepare the welcome package." As Slythe's boat docked at the crumbling jetty, Arthur didn't hide. He walked down the beach with a deliberate, slow stride, flanked by the general on his left and 24 of the largest macaques on his right. The monkeys moved in a disciplined, V-shaped tactical formation Arthur had taught them using the art of war and some leftover dried cranberries. Slythe stepped onto the jetty, looking disgusted by the humidity. He looked up, saw Arthur, and stopped dead. "Arthur! My dear fellow!" Slythe called out, his voice dripping with synthetic charm. "You look earthy. Very back to basics. I see you've gone native. It's all the rage in Silicon Valley right now. Primal retreats, they call them." "Cut the crap, Barnaby," Arthur said, stopping 10 feet away. The general bared his teeth, a sound like a dry branch snapping. "You sold me a ruin. You sold me a war zone. You committed 3 different types of international wire fraud before lunch on the day we closed. Why are you here?" Slythe's smile didn't falter, but it became sharper, more like a shark's. "Well, Arthur, there's been a bit of a title dispute. It turns out Monkey's Maw sits on a rather significant deposit of lithium-rich volcanic ash. My employer's a very large, very aggressive mining conglomerate realized that the deed I sold you had a, shall we say, expiration clause regarding mineral rights. I'm here to offer you a buyback. 10 cents on the dollar. You leave quietly, and we don't have to involve the private security contractors currently waiting on the mothership 5 miles out." Arthur looked at Slythe, then at the black boat, then at the general. The general was looking at Slive's white suit as if it were a blank canvas for a mud-bombing masterpiece. "You want the island back for the minerals," Arthur said. "And what happens to the local residents?" Slive glanced at the monkeys with total indifference. "The biological pests? Oh, the mining team has a standard relocation protocol. High-frequency sound cannons to drive them into the sea, followed by a total clearing of the canopy. It's very efficient. Very clean." The air on the beach suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. The monkeys sensed the shift. The chattering stopped. 500 pairs of golden eyes focused on Barnaby Q. Slive. "I see," Arthur said quietly. "Well, Barnaby, I've spent the last 3 weeks learning a new methodology for conflict resolution. We don't use sound cannons here. We use integrated synergy." Arthur turned to the general and gave a single, sharp nod. "The hostile takeover protocol. Execute." Slive laughed. "What? Arthur, you've lost your mind. They're just animals. You can't." The general let out a piercing, 3-tone whistle. Suddenly, the jungle erupted. From the shadows of the tree line, a swarm of Capuchins launched a coordinated aerial denial strike. They didn't use rocks. They used the seltzer slingers Arthur had helped them refine, pressurized fruit pulp canisters that exploded on contact, covering Slive and his boat in a sticky, fermented, and incredibly pungent purple goo. "What is this?" "My suit. This is Italian silk." Slive screamed, stumbling backward. "That's just the beta test," Arthur shouted over the noise. Then came the board of directors. The large macaques, led by the general, swarmed the boat. They didn't attack the men, they attacked the hardware. With a mechanical precision that would have made a pit crew proud, they began stripping the SS. Arbitrage. They unscrewed the GPS antenna, shredded the upholstery, and in a move Arthur was particularly proud of, clogged the engine's intake with a mixture of mud and Arthur's old business cards. Slive tried to reach for a radio, but a young monkey swung down, snatched it from his hand, and immediately dropped it into the ocean with a cheeky hoot. "You can't do this!" Slive yelled, slipping on a pile of fermented mangoes. "I have rights. I have a contract." "Your contract is non-compatible with the current operating system," Arthur said, crossing his arms. "This island isn't a mine. It's a sovereign primate sanctuary. And as the chief logistics officer, I'm afraid I have to deny your request for access." The general jumped onto Slive's shoulders. He didn't bite him. He simply leaned in close and let out a roar so loud it blew Slive's perfectly coiffed hair back. Then, with a practiced flick, the general reached into his cheek pouch and pulled out a small, sticky object, a single, melting Belgian chocolate bar Arthur had been saving for a special occasion. The general didn't give it to Slive. He smeared it across Slive's digital tablet, rendering the touch screen useless, and then shoved the empty foil wrapper into Slive's breast pocket. "That," Arthur translated, "is your severance package." Defeated, covered in purple goo, and surrounded by an army of primates who looked ready to start the phase 2 of the attack, which involved a lot more mud, Slive scrambled back onto his ruined boat. The engine sputtered, choked on the business card mud slurry, and finally groaned into life, puffing out a cloud of black smoke. "You'll hear from my lawyers," Slive screamed as the boat drifted away from the jetty. "I look forward to it," Arthur yelled back. "Tell them to send the subpoenas via carrier pigeon. We don't have Wi-Fi." As the SS Arbitrage limped toward the horizon, the monkeys broke into a deafening, triumphant celebration. They danced on the jetty, they somersaulted in the trees, and for the first time, they actually cheered for Arthur. The general walked over to Arthur. He reached up and straightened Arthur's tattered tactical sarong. He then took his Hermes tie, the one he had worn as a trophy, and slowly, deliberately, placed it around Arthur's neck. It was a promotion. Arthur was no longer the logistics officer. He was a partner. That evening, Arthur sat on the balcony of his renovated villa. The roof was still missing, but he had replaced it with a beautiful, waterproof canopy of woven palm fronds. The salt spring was glowing with the soft blue light of the salvaged solar lamps he had repaired. He didn't have his billions in liquid assets. He didn't have his high-tech mansion. He didn't have a single person to talk to. He looked over at the general, who was sitting on the ledge, sharing a gourmet Cavendish banana with a small, orphaned Capuchin. The general looked at Arthur, gave a short, respectful hoot, and pointed toward the stars. Arthur leaned back, sipping a cup of herbal tea brewed from island roots. The air was warm, the jungle was alive with harmony, and for the first time in 52 years, Arthur Pendleton's brain was quiet. He had bought the wrong island, fought the wrong war, and ended up with the right life. "You know, General," Arthur whispered, closing his eyes. "The ROI on this place is actually incredible. No board meetings. No quarterly reports. And the management team, well, they're a bit hairy, but they're the most honest people I've ever worked with." The general hooted softly in agreement. Somewhere in the distance, a drone likely sent by Arthur's automated subscription service that he had forgotten to cancel hummed toward the island, carrying a fresh crate of organic pineapples. Arthur Pendleton smiled. The integration phase was complete. The monkey's maw was open for business, but only if you brought the right fruit.